Welcome to the Mongabay newscast. It's January 27th, 2021, and I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, bringing you the news and inspiration from nature's front line. Today we're taking a look at agroforestry and its growing adoption around the world. Agroforestry involves the use of woody perennials like trees and shrubs together on the same land as agricultural crops or livestock. It's a land use system that has been practiced by indigenous peoples around the world for thousands of years, and indigenous peoples are still the chief practitioners of it worldwide today. But agroforestry is increasingly being implemented as a solution to the major environmental issues we're facing, including deforestation, climate change, and biodiversity loss. On today's episode of the Mongabay newscast, we've got three guests joining us. The first is Mongabay's own Erik Hoffner, the producer of this very podcast, in addition to the editor of Mongabay's agroforestry coverage. He's making his first appearance after working behind the scenes on the podcast ever since we launched in 2016. Erik tells us about the different kinds of agroforestry, Mongabay's coverage of the practice, and why more investment is badly needed. We also speak with Sarah Lovell, a professor and the director of the Center for Agroforestry at the University of Missouri in the U.S. Lovell tells us about agroforestry's history in the United States and what impacts she hopes the new Biden administration will have on agroforestry's growth.
We really need to start thinking big about making our agricultural system look different and thinking about these transformative solutions that in some ways are kind of win-win-win, where they provide the environmental benefits, but they also can be productive and provide foods, fruits, nuts, berries that are, contributing to a healthier community.
And last but certainly not least, we speak with Roger Leakey, a professor at James Cook University in Australia and vice president of the International Tree Foundation. He explains to us his extended metaphor describing how trees are much more than the lungs of the planet and discusses agroforestry in the tropics, including how agroforestry is helping build food security in Africa and Asia, as well as how agroforestry can help address problems like deforestation and climate change.
If we were to resolve the issues of failing agriculture, then by default we would solve those climate change issues, and by default we would solve the loss of biodiversity and habitat for wildlife, simply because by solving the agricultural problem we can solve all of these other issues. Agriculture is the big demon, if you like.
As mentioned earlier, Mongabay newscast producer Erik Hoffner is also the editor of Mongabay's ongoing series of articles on agroforestry. Since 2017, when the series first launched, he's edited over 36 features on what he calls the world's most climate and wildlife-friendly style of agriculture. Because it's not a widely known term, I asked Erik to start off by explaining just what agroforestry is and where it's practiced.
Agroforestry is this kind of agroecology that's practiced all around the world, mostly in the tropics, but also in temperate zones. And it's an ancient technique of growing food that's super biodiversity positive, which is one of the reasons we're really interested in it at Mongabay. Besides the other reasons that, it produces food, but it creates homes for animals to nest in and forage in. Agroforestry builds soil horizons and water tables, and it sequesters carbon from the atmosphere at a pretty great rate, because what it does is it combines food growing into a forest kind of situation. Not all the time, but a lot of times what you see with agroforestry is a kind of a food forest where useful trees are grown over things like middle story trees and berry bushes that need shade, and then underneath that you can have vegetables and chickens walking around, things like this. You make a whole ecosystem of food and wildlife and all this. So it's a very interesting way to grow food, and we think it started millennia ago with indigenous people.
Are there any particular products produced through agroforestry that our listeners might be familiar with?
The most recognizable form of agroforestry is shade-grown coffee, or bird-friendly coffee. You see that in the store. Coffee loves to grow under the shade of trees, and a lot of times it's where it grows best. Unfortunately, a lot of the really commercial-grown coffee is grown out in the open. Same thing with chocolate. So these are two very recognizable products. But also avocados and mangoes and food crops of different varieties in Africa, great kinds of melons and things like this grow underneath. And it's really powerful because, especially in the tropics, the sun can be so strong that it's too hot for plants to grow. So having a bit of shade overhead means you can grow maize underneath. Oftentimes the tree that grows above the corn rains down nutrients and it builds the water table underneath the corn. And so if that tree also produces fruit or nuts, then you have all these different products going on all at once.
What is Mongabay's coverage of agroforestry focused on?
So the series explores how this whole system is being implemented all over the world by traditional agriculturists, indigenous communities, and also new farmers, people who are just getting into it.
You wrote an op-ed for the journal Cultural Survival Quarterly back in 2018 about how agroforestry is an ancient indigenous technology that's just now coming to be appreciated by the modern world. I remember learning about the three sisters back in school, which was a planting technique widely practiced by North American indigenous cultures in which winter squash, maize, and climbing beans are planted together. Is that an example of agroforestry?
Well, it's not because they're all annuals. Agroforestry requires a woody plant in amongst or between them, but you could grow corn and beans. Like a lot of people in the Midwest are looking at agroforestry now because you can grow corn and beans between, and when I say beans, I mean soybeans, but you can grow them between long rows of apple trees, for example, and then you have an apple crop or a nut crop, and between them you have all this other stuff. So yeah, growing the three things together is a kind of agroecology. It's also called a guild. And the things feed each other, and it works great. So adding just another perennial version of a plant to the three sisters would really work. The perennial thing really makes sense because besides storing carbon, the trees and the shrubs bring up all these nutrients and water from below. They have these long tap roots that an annual can't develop so well. So what it does is it waters the system when you have woody plants involved.
There are two main kinds of agroforestry. Tell us what they are.
Sure. There's multistrata agroforestry, which is the shade-grown coffee version, or the alley cropping that you see in the European Union or here in North America. That's where you grow trees in a row, like I was just mentioning, and then crops between them. And then there's also a version of it which explicitly includes animals, which is called silvopasture. And you can imagine herds of sheep or goats ranging around underneath nut trees where the grass is allowed to grow and plants of other kinds, forbs and herbs can grow. The animals are much happier having a bit of shade, and as you probably have seen pictures of dairy farms, there's always one tree somewhere and all the cows are loafing underneath it. Well, that's for a reason. They're getting out of the sun because it stresses them out. They get overheated, and an overheated cow, for example, does not create as much milk. So you're sequestering carbon from the atmosphere, you're building the water table, and you're also benefiting your animals in a way that makes them happier and more productive. And they say that the silvopasture version of agroforestry is even more powerful in terms of its ability to sequester carbon than the shade-grown coffee picture, because as you well know, the confined animal feeding operations that we use now to create dairy products or meat are very, very carbon intensive. So getting them into the shade, ranging around on farms, sequestering carbon actually is very powerful.
Yeah, and the carbon sequestration potential is, of course, one of the main reasons why people are considering and putting into practice agroforestry techniques around the world. But there are a myriad of other benefits, as you've alluded to. Tell us about all of the conservation benefits.
Well, in every piece that I have acquired from writers about this, we've published over 36 case studies at the website of communities all around the world that are implementing it. One of the questions I ask every writer is, what do you see when you're on the farm? Are there birds in the trees? Are there praying mantises in the bushes? Ask the farmers, what does she see when she's out picking coffee? Have they noticed more peccaries wandering around among the mango trees? And they always find examples of how now that we don't grow just corn anymore, we grow trees and corn and all this other stuff, the animals have come back. And that's all anecdotal, and that's one of the elements of these articles that I love. But it's also a proven fact in the scientific literature that there's a real biodiversity benefit to agroforestry. And one example is Mount Gorongosa in Mozambique, it's a national park, and they are reforesting it in part with agroforestry. It was denuded during the Civil War there. And so they're doing shade-grown coffee, and they found an endangered, there's a new to science species of bat lives in their agroforestry setting on Mount Gorongosa. So it's pretty clear that the animals see the trees and the food sources and all this, and they're attracted. And since it's a system that welcomes, the whole variety of community, farmers are welcoming to these sort of visitors in most cases.
I remember seeing a piece on Mongabay last year saying that agroforestry isn't just better for the environment, but it's profitable too, right?
Yeah. I asked this writer to go out and talk to a bunch of different funders and farmers and find out why they're investing in the space as a business opportunity. And they do say that there's great investment potential, and people are getting into it all over the U.S., the piece was focused just on the U.S. since the writer is based here, but it's happening all over the world. And there's an example in the U.S. where there's a startup, which was part of the piece that we focused on, a startup enterprise that helps farmers transition from growing just, say, corn and soybeans to growing those corn and soybeans in between rows of apples or nut trees, that kind of thing. So what they do is they help farmers transition into it without having to lay out all the money to, buy all those apple trees and plant them and create a system and understand how it works from an agroecology perspective. This group has all of the expertise to help a farmer do that. And they de-risk it by putting the capital up front. And so that later on, when there's profit from the operation, then they share the profit. So it's a really interesting example, and it's written about in that piece.
In that op-ed for Cultural Survival Quarterly, you write that in 2017, carbon dioxide emissions increased approximately 2%, and almost a quarter of these emissions came from conventional agriculture and the conversion of forests and wetlands into farmland. So obviously, conversion of food production to agroforestry systems has enormous potential as a climate solution. Can you run down some of the numbers on that for us and tell us how much you expect to see it actually adopted as a climate solution going forward?
Yeah, agroforestry is super powerful for capturing carbon. What we know from studies in journals like Nature is that it's estimated that we have about 45 gigatons of carbon locked up in agroforestry all around the world currently. It's a figure that grows about a half a gigaton every year just by the nature of trees growing and all this, and it covers up to 1 billion hectares of the world's surface, which is about the size of Canada. So it gives you a sense of the scale. Now, if we were to ramp that up beyond what people are just currently doing in forests and fields around the world on their own, you could start to see some serious numbers, because even the IPCC has weighed in on this and said the potential for carbon removal from the atmosphere through agroforestry is about 5 billion tons per year. So, and that's a gigaton is about 1 billion tons. So we have Nature paper saying 45 gigatons. We have the IPCC.
That's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a UN body.
Saying about 5 billion can be added every year. And this really starts to add up, because, what that looks like is, that was basically 45 gigatons was something along the lines of all of the carbon emissions in 2017, for example, from the whole world. So it has a lot of potential. And it's very cheap to implement. When you look at what people are talking about with, Wall Street investing in these carbon removal machines. This is something I wrote about for the Washington Post.
Eric wrote an op-ed for the Washington Post that was published in September of 2018 and titled "A Low-Tech Method for Combating Climate Change."
That Wall Street likes to put this big checks into these research units that are trying to build these machines that will pull carbon out of the atmosphere and make gasoline out of it or whatever they're talking about. But this is all bench science. It's not proven. And here we have something like agroforestry that's ready to go. It's already implemented. It's already proven to be powerful. And it takes an investment of seeds and shovels, grafting tools, extension work, education by people who know how to do this. And there are great organizations that do education and extension work all around the world, like World Agroforestry Center does that. So my whole point with the op-ed in the Washington Post was, can you put some of this investment into agroforestry as well versus, just putting it into these technologies which may or may not even work and may not be scalable. And plus, can you imagine building a belt of machines that ring the planet that suck carbon out of the atmosphere? That's going to take a lot of carbon to just build. So, yeah, I'm really hopeful that we start looking at this more closely. Nowadays we have some forward-thinking climate plans coming out with the Biden administration putting out a plan, and agriculture is part of it. So far, I haven't seen any agroforestry component to that. But it really should be in there, I feel like. And, another example is the Farm Bureau is getting involved in looking at climate and agriculture. They've just formed this big thing with the Environmental Defense Fund and some other big NGOs to create a climate plan. This thing is 50 pages long, and it even has a section on woods on farms. But there's no mention of agroforestry or silvopasture. They don't have the vernacular yet to kind of get their arms around what agroforestry is. So part of the reason we are doing this series is to help policymakers and decision makers understand what it is and what the power is of agroforestry to answer some of the biggest questions we have now, which is obviously climate change is one of them, but also the biodiversity crisis is part of that. And good jobs. I mean, these farming takes a lot of time and know-how and handiwork and hands to do things. So you can imagine a lot of really interesting kinds of farms evolving in a way that really helps the planet.
Now we turn to our conversation with Sarah Lovell, who is a professor at the University of Missouri and also the head of the university's Center for Agroforestry, which is a leader in building our knowledge of the science underlying agroforestry practices. We asked Lovell to tell us about the state of agroforestry in the U.S. today, and as it happens, the Center for Agroforestry's annual symposium kicks off the day after this episode goes live. So I imagine the symposium will feature discussions on some of the main issues around agroforestry right now, yeah?
Yeah, definitely. So every year we do an annual symposium, and it has a different focus area, a different theme. So this year for 2021, we're focused on community health and resilient food systems. So it includes agroforestry, but also goes beyond just agroforestry. So some of the themes we have, we're looking at specialty crops and particularly those that are oriented towards healthier diets, but also healthier environment. We're also interested in innovative community development and more on the advocacy end of that. And then also thinking about access and equity for a socially just food system. So all those topics kind of wrap into kind of this broader theme then of health and resilient food systems.
I would love it if you could talk a bit about the history of agroforestry here in the U.S. I was watching a talk you gave on YouTube, and you said that America's first sort of brush with agroforestry was back in the Dust Bowl era. Can you tell us about that?
Well, I'll first say that would not have been our first brush with it by any means, that actually our roots are in indigenous cultures on the land that were definitely very much engaged with agroforestry practices that are even helping to inform our work now. Probably the presentation you were looking at was more along the lines of when we really took a landscape view and started to really work with spatial analysis to help determine where the optimal areas for integrating agroforestry would be. And so with that particular project, it was after the Dust Bowl, and there are serious implications for soil health and for air quality. And so this massive effort was taken on to do what we now do in geographic information systems in GIS, which is conduct a spatial analysis to identify the most ideal zones to integrate windbreaks across the landscape. And what was amazing, I think, to me was that there were just so many different landowners that committed to that project and that actually took land out of production to integrate agroforestry windbreak plantings.
And how has the use of agroforestry in the U.S. developed since then?
In some ways, it's been kind of similar until recent years. I would say that we've continued in the U.S. to kind of put agroforestry at the edges of places and like thinking about it on the edges of fields as windbreaks or like in riparian zones.
Riparian zones are, of course, areas bordering rivers and other bodies of surface water.
And the focus has very much been on the environmental benefits. So the soil conservation is one piece, but also looking at water quality, wildlife habitat, biodiversity conservation, carbon sequestration, etc. And I would say one thing that we've been kind of missing in the US is thinking about the production opportunities in the agroforestry systems themselves. We have done a lot of research looking at alley cropping, but typically it's thinking about like integrating trees into existing conventional cropping systems, which can be pretty complicated, particularly with the systems that we have today.
And as you mentioned, agroforestry in some form was being practiced here in North America before there even was a United States of America. My understanding is that it probably has its roots in Mayan culture, but could be even older. What kinds of agroforestry were indigenous peoples of North America practicing, and how much does it resemble what we're doing today?
Yeah, so a lot of the indigenous communities in North America would have been practicing probably what would most resemble what we think of as a form of forest farming, where they would be working within the existing forest to help to encourage some of the species that they were most interested in. So it might have been gathering berries and gathering nuts, but in some cases kind of working with the environment to, again, encourage greater production of those species and really identifying which species could provide healthy food and medicinal resources, and even thinking beyond just the trees and shrubs, what other plants grow well in that forest understory. So definitely very strong roots connected with that heritage of agroforestry.
When you say agroforestry, most people who have even heard of it probably think about shade-grown coffee or chocolate. Mm-hmm. But what does it actually look like here in the U.S.? Can you give us some examples?
I would say maybe the most common thing that we see is the riparian buffer zone, so that forested area used to protect water resources. There's definitely been a lot of funding put toward that over the years, and of course there are many environmental benefits with that particular type of agroforestry practice. The water quality, erosion control, soil health, and also the wildlife habitat. So because it's near a water resource, you have kind of a more unique environment that really promotes a lot of different species. And then you also benefit from that biodiversity conservation. But I guess what we're starting to see a lot of interest in is a greater encouragement of tree crops. And so looking at how agroforestry actually could be a more productive component itself. And so kind of more thinking about how do we start with the trees that could be species that produce fruits and nuts and berries, and then layer in the other pieces of it.
What do you see as the biggest potential or the biggest untapped potential for agroforestry in the U.S.?
I really do think it is related to that, really focusing on those tree crops, and particularly ones that produce foods that are high in nutrients, very nutrient dense foods and connecting that with the human nutrition piece. I also see that kind of the first step at getting toward that might be really looking at lands that are kind of marginal for other types of production. They're maybe not super ideal for conventional annual cropping systems. And I kind of refer to those as opportunity lands. They're marginal for certain types of crops, but they can be actually ideal for other types of crops. Like there are lands that have highly erodible soils that people still do put conventional crops on, but would be much more suited to, say, chestnuts or some sort of tree nut species. And so I think those are some of the really great opportunities, and really kind of focusing on those tree crops that can provide a marketable product.
So sustainable food production and livelihoods, it sounds like, is what you're talking about. But of course, one of the big reasons agroforestry is generating such interest today is its potential for mitigating climate change. A lot of that is centered more around the tropics, but how much potential is there for carbon sequestration and those types of benefits here in the U.S.?
Well, I think the potential is actually huge. In tropical zones, the focus has been on trying to reduce the loss of trees. Here in the U.S. in particular, we have so much opportunity to actually plant a lot more trees. And so, so much of our agricultural land is in annual cropping systems where the ground isn't covered for a good part of the year. And so, carbon is not being sequestered over time. Adding trees into those landscapes, or actually completely replacing them with tree crops and other sorts of perennial species, could just have a huge impact. I mean, everything that we see in that tree biomass is carbon being stored. And we know that tree planting is one of the greatest opportunities that we have for mitigation. So I think it's great. There's also the piece about adaptation, that these systems have a variety of different species, many of which are better adapted to our current climate and future climate, and are better able to withstand some of the climate extremes like floods and droughts and things like that.
How much silvopasture is going on here in the U.S., and how much unrealized potential is there for that particular type of agroforestry?
We see silvopasture on small diversified farms, a portion of them, but there is a lot more potential with that for sure. And, we kind of look at two different pathways to get to silvopasture. So one is looking at livestock that are currently pastured. They're on perennial grasses and maybe legumes, but they don't have trees in those systems. So in that case, you're looking at the potential to add trees into those systems to sequester carbon. They provide shade for livestock, which can help the livestock perform better and have implications for animal welfare. And just having another product. You could plant trees that are either going to be timber crops, or, could be a fruit or nut crop. So that's one pathway, is the planting trees gaining trees. So the other pathway is integrating livestock into existing forest or wooded areas. So in that case, the benefit we would see is that with this added income of allowing livestock in there, maybe there's a greater potential for the landowner to retain that forested system instead of getting rid of it and replacing it with some other form of agriculture. So again, this kind of land use piece of the climate resilience question is an important one here.
Well, the big news is certainly the new Biden administration, which has already committed the U.S. to rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. So there's a lot of hope that America is going to be back on the side of climate solutions. What are your hopes for the new administration in terms of climate action and agroforestry being a part of whatever actions the U.S. might commit to?
I'm quite optimistic, honestly. I think the focus on climate resilience is going to be strong. And I think we have such a good case to make with agroforestry because of that tree carbon sequestering component. It's like, unlike some of the other strategies that are maybe not everybody agrees on certain strategies and how much carbon can be built or stored in the soil under different conditions, how long, how stable it is. But the one thing we know is with tree biomass that we're we're sequestering that carbon. We can see it, it's there, it's measurable. And it doesn't take a huge amount of time to make a good start on that. So I think we have a really good case to make. I think the tricky part is making sure that these types of systems get the attention that they deserve and that they're not overtaken, I guess, by some of the other sustainable approaches that maybe aren't as transformative. They're more incremental types of changes and really like making the case for the transformative type of agriculture. I guess another opportunity I see is also connecting with the nutrition part. So making that leap from thinking about our agricultural system and what is it that we're growing? What is the point of what we're growing? Do we want to, grow foods that contribute to less healthy diets, poor diets, or do we want to grow foods that are very closely linked with what the guidelines are for contributing to human health?
The U.S. Department of Agriculture has a National Agroforestry Center that was founded in 1990, so there's some infrastructure there to promote the use of agroforestry. What do you think needs to happen to really expand its use, though?
Yeah, like you said, there's a good amount of infrastructure. Our center has been doing research since 1998, and we have a variety of tree crops that are kind of ready to go, on the ground, ready to go. And so, I think the opportunities are great there. So unlike some of the other types of systems, we have species and cultivars that are developed for different regions, and we can offer solutions that can be have good commercial potential at this point. One of the biggest barriers is that there's this large upfront investment when it comes to tree crops, and they don't start paying off for some years. Particularly if we're talking about nut crops, it can be, up to 10 years before the grower sees a payback in that. So, thinking about what are the policy options for trying to help landowners with that transition, and maybe providing some support. Maybe thinking about how we reorient some of our subsidies so that they're more designed to help with the types of crops that promote good human health. So there are definitely some tricky parts to this, and even thinking about land tenure and, with these longer term tree crops, a person can't just go out and lease a piece of land for a couple of years and hope that they're going to be able to have access to that into the years that are required to have a harvestable product. So just need to be thinking about and developing strategies for making that transition. And I guess kind of just the overall theme is that we really need to start thinking big about making our agricultural system look different and thinking about these transformative solutions that in some ways are kind of win-win-win, where they provide the environmental benefits, they store the carbon, they conserve biodiversity, provide wildlife habitat, but they also can be productive and provide foods, fruits, nuts, berries that are, contributing to a healthier community. And the other thing is they can contribute to even a more kind of localized food system. And that's something I guess that we saw with COVID was there were disruptions in the system in certain areas. And it really did highlight the need to think about growing crops that communities can use directly. It's just kind of funny that we live, a lot of us live in rural areas. We're surrounded by agriculture, as far as the eye can see, but most of what we're looking at, we can't consume directly. And so it's not really providing anything in terms of that local food resilience to keep the community going.
And finally, we'll get into our discussion with Roger Leakey, who's here to help us delve deeper into agroforestry in the tropics. Leakey is a crop physiologist and tree biologist who has spent his career working in forestry and agroforestry with the goal of helping to reverse deforestation and desertification in the tropics, while also alleviating poverty, malnutrition, and hunger in developing countries, particularly in Africa and Oceania. In January of 2018, Leakey published a commentary piece on Mongabay called "Trees Are Much More Than the Lungs of the World." The piece is built around a brilliant and very extended metaphor, or perhaps I should say series of metaphors, that attempt to convey just how vital trees are to the healthy functioning of all life on our planet.
We frequently hear, of course, people saying trees are the lungs of the world. And I guess, in a sense, that upsets me because it's very much an underestimate of the role that trees do play. I think we can consider them to be the kidneys of the world as well, because they regulate the flow and use of water by intercepting rain and by releasing it back into the ground, where it then gets into the river system, the groundwater systems, and then plants take it up and use it in photosynthesis, and then transpire the water back out into the atmosphere. So there's a whole concept there around the kidneys, and I think trees certainly play that role in terms of their photosynthesis and transpiration and uptake of water from the soil. Then I think we can also think of them a bit as the skin of the world, because they are the interface between the vegetation and the atmosphere in terms of things like the exchange of gases and water. And in gases, of course, we have all the climate change gases as well. I think we can also consider them to be like the intestines of the world, because they are where the soil and the trees and the plants and all aspects of the vegetation actually interchange and exchange nutrients in both directions. In that sense, they also help to be part of the carbon cycle, crucial part of the carbon cycle, which is also all happening at this interface. And then finally, I think we can think of them, perhaps most importantly, as the heart of the world, because they drive all the ecosystem functions that natural vegetation and natural forests, for example, provide probably the most sustainable kind of land use that there is, and trees are keystone components of that, in that they create niches in which can be colonized by a whole range of organisms, both above and below ground. But it's as a three-dimensional structure is crucial for the food chains and the life cycles and all of the interactions that take part in making an ecosystem function properly. So those are the sort of key elements, I guess, that make trees much more than just the lungs.
I read an article on Mongabay from 2017 in which you're quoted, where you say that there are a lot of definitions of agroforestry out there. Will you tell us how you define it?
Yes, there are lots of definitions. Well, I think we need to think of trees as being the means to establishing an agroecological succession. So I think people will be aware of an ecological succession in terms of natural vegetation.
Ecological succession is essentially the ways the species structure of an ecosystem changes over time.
But when we get into agriculture, of course, we remove most of that vegetation. Basically, typically in industrialized agriculture, just have a monoculture of a single species, single crop, so that's a very poor example of an ecosystem. And if we introduce trees into the farming system, then we can, if you like, capture all of those things we've just been talking about. The trees can start to play the roles that we've just been discussing. In that way, they can create an agroecosystem that will progress with time to become more biodiverse as other species come in and live in the shade of the tree or in the branches of the tree or on the root systems or whatever. And so over time, biodiversity increases in these kinds of systems, and trees play a vital function in terms of allowing all that to be set up. And so agroforestry, if you like, is the man-made approach to creating that kind of an agroecosystem. That differs from many of the sort of older definitions which see agroforestry just as an agronomic practice, which is, it still is that, but I think if we want to understand it, we really need to see it as a means of getting an ecosystem functioning in farmland.
Agroforestry is being implemented around the world today, and awareness of it as a more sustainable farming practice is growing amongst modern farmers. But agroforestry really goes back thousands of years and is already widely practiced by indigenous peoples today, right?
Yes, that's true in a sense. It's obviously over the millennia, agriculture sort of moved away from that kind of approach, much more towards what we now see as intensive industrial agriculture. But yes, indigenous peoples around the world have understood the role of trees and have made use of the trees both in their culture and in their daily lives, and also all those functions that we were talking about. Those are all of importance to local people. So they have a much better understanding of all of that than we do today. And dare I say it, it's the politicians and the policymakers and perhaps agribusiness who don't understand the role of trees. There's still this general feeling in the world, I think, that if you want to practice agriculture, the first thing you do is cut down the trees. And that's just so wrong.
One of the main reasons there's so much interest in agroforestry today is the huge potential for carbon sequestration it presents. Of course, deforestation and land degradation are major sources of emissions, so keeping forests standing and intact is another important climate solution. Can you talk a bit about how agroforestry improves the productivity of farmland and can help alleviate the kinds of pressures that lead to deforestation and land degradation?
There's a tendency in public life for many people to think in silos. So, you could frequently read articles in the press or see them on TV or wherever. We're going to solve climate change. We're going to solve poverty. We're going to solve biodiversity loss. And that's just ridiculous, really, because all of these things are intertwined and you can't address one of them successfully without addressing all of them. So I'm a very strong advocate of the use of agroforestry as a holistic approach to resolving all of these big issues, as I said in my very first words. I think we have to understand. But before we get into that, let's just remind ourselves what the big problems are. As you mentioned, land degradation, that's deforestation, it's the loss of soil fertility, it's erosion, and it's the loss of biodiversity and all of those sorts of things. And that leads to less successful agriculture, because agriculture depends very much on the nutrients and the water. And indeed, people don't recognize it so much, but also on the biodiversity. And the consequence of that, of course, is that we have global hunger, we have global malnutrition. And that's also all tied up with the fact that many of the farmers, the bulk of the farmers in the world, are smallholder subsistence farmers who are on a level of extreme poverty, with incomes of $2 to $3, $4 a day. And if your income is that sort of level, then you just can't afford the inputs of modern conventional intensive agriculture. So we have to find ways of resolving the land degradation in ways that don't cost money, but do solve the hunger and the malnutrition issues and make tropical agriculture function properly. Just to perhaps illustrate the failure of tropical agriculture, if you take, say, the maize crop, which of course is the main crop of Africa, the average yield that farmers across the whole of Africa achieve is somewhere around 1.5 tons per hectare. But the potential yield of the varieties that they're actually growing, in terms of the breeding that's gone into them, those yields are somewhere around 6-7 tons per hectare. So mammoth gap between the potential yield of those crops and the actual yield. And that's the real issue in terms of solving hunger. And so filling that, what's known as a yield gap, I think is the crux of what we need to be doing. Now, I said that behind all of that lies land degradation in its various forms, and poverty and all the social issues that run along with that. And social injustice is very much part of the life of subsistence farmers, and that's why they get into migration to Europe and America, and why we see so much social conflict perhaps around the tropics as well. And much of this arises from the fact that the policymakers and the donors and agribusiness and everybody who's driving the agricultural agenda in the world thinks narrowly of what works in the temperate zone. So the temperate style of agriculture has been, if you like, imposed on the rest of the world and told, well, this is how you do it. You clear your trees, you grow a monoculture, you put on lots of fertilizers. And that just doesn't work in the situation of a subsistence farmer in Africa. So that kind of top-down imposition of what they should be doing is lying behind those yield gaps that we've been talking about. And so what does agroforestry do? Well, agroforestry, as I said, is a way of starting the healing process, the restoration of a functioning agroecosystem. And so the first thing we can do is to use the sorts of trees that capture nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it into the soil, the nitrogen fixing trees, which are leguminous trees. They will do that job free of charge. And just so the farmer just needs to grow a fairly high density patch of those trees and shrubs to raise the maize yield from that 1 or so ton to 3 or 4 tons per hectare, just by restoring soil nitrogen. But of course, the soil fertility problem is bigger than that, because it's also lacking in phosphorus and potassium and trace elements, etc. And those, it's impossible to generate those biologically. So we have to think there of using inorganic fertilizers. Now, if you haven't got any money, you can't do that. So the next step I think we have to achieve is, how do you start to generate income in these kinds of farming systems and these kinds of communities? And so when back in the 90s, we started talking to farmers and saying, well, what would you really like from agriculture? Their first reaction was sort of astonishment. And they said, well, we've never been asked that before. You white guys always tell us what we should do. And we said, okay, well, what do you really want? And they said, well, in the past, we used to use products from the natural vegetation, from the forest. We used to use all of those as our traditional foods and for all of our day-to-day needs, medicines, etc. And so we said, okay, well, why don't we start to see if we can help you to cultivate those? And they said, well, that would be great. Yeah, we'd love to do that. So what was missing then was an understanding of how they might do that. And I think what emerged from all of this is we started farmer training schools, or rural resource centers, as we call them, as we started developing those in the communities to provide the capacity and understanding and the knowledge and the skills and the techniques and the strategies that would allow them to grow that for themselves. Once they hooked onto that, they got really excited. And so it grew from something like 10 farms in 2 villages. Over 10 years, it grew to 10,000 farmers in 500 villages, just more or less by organic growth, because we were showing them how to do the things that they wanted to do, instead of imposing things they'd never heard of and species they'd never heard of, foreign species, foreign ideas on them. And so just by building from the grassroots up rather than imposing from the top down, and allowing them to be the drivers of their own initiative, allowing them to be the beneficiaries of whatever they'd achieved, that just provided a huge incentive and allowed them then to start doing the sorts of things that we've been talking about. And then the third step that follows up from all of that is that once you start growing these indigenous plants that are useful, and perhaps I should just go back a step here in terms of the thinking, there's something like 20,000 species in the world that produce edible products. And there's vastly more than that produce medicinal products and are used in traditional medicine thing. So wherever you are in the world, there are local species which produce foods and medicines and all poles and craft products and all the sorts of things that you might want every day if you were living at that sort of subsistence level. And so the potential to build on that traditional knowledge and that traditional understanding and all of these indigenous species allows you then to see that you could market. And many of these products are locally marketed. We do tend to hear people say, oh, these are famine foods. That's just, again, another myth. Some of them are okay, not very tasty, but there are huge numbers almost everywhere in the world where those sorts of indigenous plants are actually marketed locally. They're appreciated by local people, and they have this potential then to be developed as crops. And the next crucial thought from that is that if you actually go out there and start looking at any one of these species, you find that if you look at a fruit, for example, there's going to be anything from 3 to 10-fold variation in fruit size in a wild population, because trees are just like people in terms of the genetic structure of the population. So if you look around a room full of 100 people, you see all sorts of shapes, sizes, and colors of hair and eye colors, etc. Trees are just as diverse as that. And so in a population of 100 trees, you will find trees that produce fruits or nuts or leaves or bark or whatever you're interested in that has that sort of 3 to 10-fold variation. And that then means all the farmer has to do is to go out into his farm or his local bit of forest or whatever, say this, okay, I know this tree has fruits that are bigger. I know this tree has fruits that are sweeter. I know this tree has fruits that get held longer into the dry season, and I can market them at a higher price. People have that knowledge. They know that. And so it's very easy for them to identify in their own patch species that are going to outperform the average of that species hugely. And so by very simple, low-tech application of horticulture, you can help them to understand how they can develop a cultivar in 2 or 3 years. And once they've got that cultivar, then they can mass produce it as, in effect, clonal material, just as we have in apples and plums and oranges and everything else. They can do that for their own species and start to market those plants to neighbors. They can start marketing the fruits or nuts or whatever it is in local markets. And the advantage that bulking up that has is that the price then goes up from the current price, which is the average for a mixed bag of fruits and nuts, to a price which can be specific to a particular cultivar, just as we buy a particular apple or whatever in the supermarket. So the commercialization is the next thought, the third step. And then once you start thinking about that, we actually know that nearly all of these species contain all sorts of different biochemicals or different levels of nutrients, different fatty acids. Anything you care to think of is varying in the same sort of 3 to 10-fold levels. And so if you have a species that has the potential to become a cosmetic oil or a medicinal product or maybe some functional food high in vitamins or whatever, then you only have to go out into that wild population and you will find individuals that meet that particular requirement. And so it's relatively easy then for these farmers to develop cultivars that will be marketable and have the potential to be then for small local businesses to process them and to trade them more widely and to be able to store them so that they can be traded across the whole year rather than just over the 2 or 3 months when they're fresh. So going back then, there's these 3 steps that I think agroforestry can help us to solve many of these big issues. The first is to improve the soil fertility. The second is to be domesticated to produce important new products. And then thirdly, to commercialize those products. And on top of that, then you also have the fact that as you cultivate those in your farming system, you create this more functional farming system, agroecosystem that provides sustainability. And so, that's quite a long answer to your question, but I think that's basically what it all boils down to.
Yeah, and how does all that help reduce the demand for new land for agriculture and hence reduce deforestation pressure?
That's a fascinating question because, as I said earlier on, currently the farmers are only growing their crops at sort of 10-15% of their potential, and therefore they have to keep clearing land to get enough fertile land to be able to grow their next crop. If we can solve the soil fertility problem, and if we can improve those yields right up to their full potential, then actually we would need far less land for agriculture in the tropics. And that means then that at the same time as that, we're producing these new farming systems rich in trees that are sequestering carbon and are restoring the soil fertility, etc. We actually have a functional system that then is also going to be a resource of biodiversity. It will help to conserve a very wide range of plants and animals. And so we can start to see that actually we can both feed the world and sequester the carbon and improve wildlife habitat at the same time, and actually have much less land under cultivation and more under trees to provide all these global benefits. So I think we could very easily produce the food of the world needs for a much smaller area of land, and make the planet a much healthier place to live, and so improve everything globally as well as locally.
Could you share a specific example or two of how a local or indigenous community in tropical Africa or Asia has used agroforestry to build the resilience and food security of their community?
Yeah, the best example is where we started this work in Cameroon in the 1990s. And so there, as I said, we've gone up from 10 farmers in 2 villages to 10,000 in 500 villages. And those farmers are now growing about 10 or 15 different indigenous fruits and nuts on their farm, and they're marketing them locally. And in some cases, there are local women's groups that are starting to process those products and make them available. And that's in turn providing work in the local towns, producing simple dryers and grinders and oil crushers. And so it starts to create a rural economy, and that's happening in the southwest of Cameroon. And that's the best example, because that's the longest running example. But there are similar things happening in other parts of Africa and in Solomon Islands, for example, in the Pacific. And in Latin America, etc. Mongabay has written up quite a lot of those sorts of case studies on their online series.
I wanted to ask you to talk a bit more about how wildlife benefits from agroforestry. I know in your book, Living with the Trees of Life, which came out in 2012, you cited a study that showed Indonesian home gardens, which are actually diverse food forests, contain up to 70% of the biodiversity of the surrounding rainforest. Is that right?
Yeah, no, that's right. So if as I said when we were talking about the role of trees, if you have a tree growing in your home garden or in your field system, it starts to create a microclimate for the colonization of niches within it, whether it's insects or birds or small mammals or whatever. So and you get huge numbers of some of the microorganisms both above and below ground, so that you actually start to create a very complex and extremely diverse ecosystem, even within a single tree. And that process then of just starting to grow trees anywhere is a way of diversifying the biodiversity that's at that place. And so when in these examples in Indonesia and other parts, and many places around Latin America, there's been a lot of good work done to demonstrate the ways in which trees are providing the niches and the habitat for a very wide range of species. Everything from the smallest microbe right up to, well, not quite as far as elephants perhaps, but right up to big mammals as well. There's one example, I think, from Indonesia of Sumatran rhino, which is a rare animal and orangutans living in some of these agroforests. So yeah, you can, once you've got the scale, so you have to have scale, of course, to get these bigger things in and able to have a functional population. But if all of this gets scaled up sufficiently, then there's no reason why you can't have it right the way up to, and of course, man is the top predator. So we ought to see man as part of this agroecosystem as well.
So we should expand the use of agroforestry, but where should we be expanding it? Presumably not on top of existing forests, right?
No, not on top of existing forests. The greatest potential is in the tropics and subtropics, where there's so much degraded. There's something like 30 to 40% of the farmland is severely degraded in those areas. So those are the sort of target spots for where it should be done. The problem, of course, is that there is not much political will to do all of this at the scale that's needed. And so that was one of the reasons why we started working directly with farmers, because they can do it for themselves, and then that it can snowball away out from those villages. To get governments and policymakers to change their minds and think differently, have a new mindset, then if they were to promote this kind of activity on a big scale, Africa would be a very crucial place, but almost anywhere in the tropics as well. And there's still a lot that we can learn from all of this in the temperate zone. I mean, there's good agroforestry systems set up in the US, in Europe, in England. So it applies everywhere, but the biggest needs and the biggest opportunities are definitely in the tropics, particularly where you've got subsistence farmers who can get into this quite easily and really benefit from it.
As the world grapples with climate change, do you see that as an opportunity to promote and expand agroforestry around the world?
Yes, that's definitely true. But I think at the same time, if we think of this, outside the silo thinking, if we were to resolve the issues of failing agriculture, then by default, we would solve those climate change issues, and by default, we would solve the loss of biodiversity and habitat for wildlife, simply because by solving the agricultural problem, we can solve all of these other issues. Agriculture is the big demon, if you like. And if we can solve that, then many of these other things would happen just by default. I mean, that doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't be promoting them for climate change, but there is, again, this tendency to people to think in silos and think, well, we have to plant trees. And if you're going to plant trees, where do you plant trees? You plant them in forests. Well, actually, forests are probably the least secure place to plant trees, because it's in forests that people come in and do deforestation, because they're clearing for the land for agriculture. So actually, it's better to plant those trees in agricultural systems and create an alternative to forest that then sequesters the carbon and takes the pressures off the forest. So there's a lot of ways of just thinking differently about the way we do our business, which can solve these problems, I think.
Are you optimistic that people can and will change the way they think about how we're doing our business?
There is hope beginning to appear. I'm involved with a number of organizations helping them to try and move some of this stuff forwards. And obviously in the United Nations, we have the Sustainable Development Goals. There's 17 of them, in a sense that they all think in silos. But what we've been talking about, I think it can actually have positive impacts on 14 of those 17 Sustainable Development Goals by the sorts of things we've been talking about. And then in Africa, where my heart is, a number of African countries, now some 30 or more African countries, have now signed up to a thing called AFR 100. That's the restoration of 100 million hectares of land that the countries are putting as their priority area of work. And then the United Nations, African Union has also set up a thing called the Agenda 2063 on a headline of the Africa we want. And I think we're starting to see African countries and other tropical countries actually standing up for themselves and saying, okay, we want to go in a different direction from the way that you guys in the West have been pushing for the last 100 years or so. And they've also signed a thing recently called the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, again, which is African countries starting to say, well, we want to do things differently. And so when you bring those things together, you start to see movement in the right direction. And perhaps the only thing that's missing there at the moment is how do we achieve it? And I guess the how is what we've been talking about for the last half hour or so.
If you enjoy the Mongabay newscast, we ask that you please help spread the word by telling a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep the show growing. For instance, if you know someone who's really interested in agriculture or agroforestry in particular, this would be the perfect episode to send them. Another way to help is by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. We are a nonprofit news organization, so just $1 or more per month would really help us offset production costs and hosting fees. Supporters at the $10 a month level also get access to our members-only insider content. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Front Line, please head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast. That's patreon.com/Mongabay. You and your friend can subscribe to the Mongabay newscast wherever you get your podcasts from. Or you can download our new app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay Newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And of course, you can read all of our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com. Or if you prefer to keep up with us on social media, follow us at facebook.com/Mongabay or on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is @Mongabay on both those platforms. Thanks as always for listening to the Mongabay Newscast. I'm your host, Mike Gorecki, signing off. Talk to you again in 2 weeks.